Our third speaker today is Maya Ratnam, who is an anthropologist, currently an assistant professor at Ahmedabad University. Her areas of focus are the environmental history and anthropology of India, with particular reference to indigenous and resource-dependent communities, forest rights, and cultural ecology. Maya received her PhD in anthropology from Johns Hopkins University in the United States in 2017, and her dissertation was titled Dwelling in the Forest, Nature, Power, and Society in Tribal Central India. She has been awarded the prestigious New India Foundation Fellowship to revise her dissertation as a book. Hopefully, we're going to be reading the book in the next few years. Thank you, Maya. Over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to share my screen and then just open with a few preliminary remarks. I must say I feel very much like a privileged interloper into this conversation because I have not really thought systematically about race or race scholarship in my own work. And after hearing these talks, I'm realizing that it's I can hardly afford to continue to not do that. Thank you, so Tejaswini, for inviting me to be a part of this, and thank you, Roberto and Holly, for being such fantastic organizers. As Roberto mentioned, my own research is on indigenous communities in India who are also known as Adivasi, and on their land and forest claims in context of accelerated land grab and enclosure. And in my own thinking about this topic, I didn't really foreground really the question of race. You will recall that Tejaswini talked about the overlaps between caste and race. At least in the sort of earlier colonial scholarship and some post-colonial scholarship, the category of tribe has also been thought through the lens of race. And in fact, between caste and tribe, race has really been the sort of triangulating third, which seems to have fallen out of the discourse a little bit. It is being revived by work such as Wilkerson, etc., on caste, but it's quite interesting to reflect on what's happening with this term in the case of tribe. Yet, as many historians have shown, a lot of the 19th century race scholarship played an important role in constructing tribes or tribal communities as categories which were ethnically distinct from the mainstream Indian populace. And this imagination is operationalized and routinely reenacted in anthropological surveys of tribes commissioned by the Indian government. And while cranial measurements, etc., were once indicators of racial types, now the government collects blood samples to categorize tribal groups anthropologically. While scholars and intellectuals outside of the state draw upon race in other ways, in thinking critically about the systemic oppressions and vulnerabilities that indigenous communities in India face, the racial imaginary of tribal populations continues to animate much government discourse, even though the Indian government officially denies that there are indigenous populations. And two sort of recent examples of this sort of representation of indigenous communities, which became controversial. One was this is the Kalinga Institute of Social Sciences in the state of Odisha, which is a tribal boarding school or residential school with some disturbing sorts of affinities to the kind of residential schools in Canada, Australia, etc., which attempt to take tribal children away from their homes and reschool them and mainstream them in often violent ways. And the World Anthropology Congress canceled its event that was to be held in the Lingnan Institute of Social Sciences The other is this recent news item on the Baiga community, who are a particularly vulnerable tribal group in central India. And I had done my own fieldwork with the Baiga community. And the state of Chhattisgarh, which is a central Indian state, recently held an exhibition of the Baiga in which they were treated as exhibits that people came to photograph and photograph themselves with, in a very troubling reminder of the sort of colonial imagination or imaginations of how specifically racialized bodies, non-white bodies can be exhibited. So this was just two sort of brief instances of this kind of imagination that persists in how the state tends to think about indigenous or tribal communities, no matter how much this may have fallen out of a lot of scholarly discourse. But for the remainder of this presentation, I actually want to go in a slightly different direction. I want to offer some very exploratory thoughts on how insights from this current conversation on race can be brought into conversation with the present day realities of tribal, nomadic, and semi-nomadic communities in India, particularly those deemed to belong to formerly criminal tribes, which is a colonial classification I will say more about shortly. And I've been looking at working more on the idea of criminality and the colonial and post-colonial constructions of criminality and how this comes to bear disproportionately on certain groups which have been historically labeled or historically targeted as criminals. And I realize that this conversation on race can perhaps help me with that. So in the spirit of racisms in global context, I thought we could look a little bit at this question. Just bear with me if my reflections are not very polished or thought through. This is just a very kind of exploratory kind of question. So I look at three instances. One is a recently released super hit film in a Tamil language film called Jai Bhim, which also focuses on nomadic, semi-nomadic, and formerly criminal tribes, unusual topic for a mainstream big budget film in a popular regional language like Tamil. I look at an ethnographic text, which is Anand Pandyan's work on the Pramalai colors of South India. And I also, through a few news reports and other sort of contemporary reportage, look at briefly at a community in Ahmedabad called the Charas, who live in an area called Charanagar. So the questions that I'm hoping to look at are, can the question of criminal tribes help us think about race not as a master category or umbrella term for naturalized difference that informs discrimination across contexts, but as a cluster of affects, effects, and forces refracted through and localized upon particular bodies, relations, and terrains. I would like to explore if the evidence on the colonial criminalization and policing of criminal tribes and the afterlives thereof can help us reflect on race and nature as the entwined grounds of the production of difference, power, and violence enacted on particular bodies under particular historical conditions. In this, I borrow from the geographer and noted prison abolitionist Ruth Wilson Gilmore's formulation that racism can be conceived of as the state-sanctioned and or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. Given that many formerly criminal tribes are resource-dependent and follow animal-based livelihoods such as hunting, trapping, and cattle rearing, and are itinerant and often without a clear dwelling place, I venture that the criminal tribes or caste question also allows us to dwell on the troubling interface between racialized violence and criminality and animality. So under the Criminal Tribes Act of 1871, members of putatively criminal tribes or individuals from social groups identified by the colonial state to have criminal heredity had to register themselves as such under their local magistrate and voluntarily submit to harsh policing measures, including possible settlement and confinement to state reformatories. After many decades of brutal treatment, these communities were denotified, leading to the appellation denotified tribes or DNTs. The Criminal Tribes Act itself was replaced with the Habitual Offenders Act of 1952, which, as spokesperson and DNT activists have argued, continues to stigmatize and arbitrarily penalize members of these formerly criminal tribes. In one of the essays that I had assigned, the legal historian Mark Brown argues that race science of the 19th century strongly underwrote the delineation of what constituted crime in colonial India. Evolutionary biology offered the necessary scientific validation for Orientalist constructions of native groups as so many castes, classes, and tribes possessed of distinct physical, socio-cultural, and moral characteristics. Brown notes, along with many post-colonial scholars, that the determinism of racial biology allowed for the hierarchical ordering of the colonized with the colonizer at the top, but also for comparability across difference. So those identified as hereditary criminals in the colony could be directly compared in terms of traits and characteristics to the criminal in lower classes in the metropole, as could the techniques for their control, reform, or incarceration. Brown notes that the containment of crime and its policing acquired greater importance after the mutiny of 1857. Many nomadic and semi-nomadic communities, agrarian castes, forest-dwelling tribes, mendicants, eunuchs, that's the legal category, performing communities, and communities that depended on hunting and trapping animals for a livelihood came under the broad sweep of the Criminal Tribes Act. Brown describes the anti-thuggy and anti-dacoity campaigns of the 1830s and 40s that sketched detailed genealogies of thug communities and enumerated their languages and social practices in detail. Brown further argues that as the link between occupation and caste grew stronger from the 1850s, it also made linkages between hereditary criminality stemming from association with particular occupations easier to sustain, monitor, and police. So my tentative intervention here is that once the association with criminality has persevered long enough, it no longer needs a strict logic of racial biology to defend or uphold it. In the case of criminal tribes, the natural and social come to mutually penetrate each other to naturalize criminality or criminal characteristics of particular tribes or caste groups. The fluid norms of purity and pollution that then underpin caste discrimination ensure that the biomoral qualities that cause criminality too can spread through contagion and proximity. So from animal to human, from lower caste human to upper caste, and between the members of the tribe or caste in question. So I'll move now to a description of the three cases that I had chosen for this discussion. As I said, the recent Tamil language blockbuster Jai Bhim, starring the famous Tamil actor Surya in the role of activist lawyer Chandru, focuses on the contemporary afterlives of the colonial policing of criminal tribes. One of the few, if not, I think the only mainstream films to focus on the present day vulnerabilities of formerly criminal tribes. I would like to draw attention to the film's treatment of two themes in particular. One is the proximity to animal-based practices or animal-dependent livelihoods that frequently makes DNTs the target of revulsion and hate from neighboring communities and state agents. And second, the problem of police violence and custodial death, especially of the poor, which assumed frightening proportions during COVID-19. So the film itself is a fairly sort of straightforward in its genre. So it combines a kind of social justice issue-based drama with the hit commercial Tamil film format with this overpowering male hero, in this case, the lawyer played by actor Surya as the rescuer of innocent tribal communities. But the case material which the film takes up is actually real and is quite accurately depicted, as has been as earlier conversations with Justice Chandru, I knew that. So the film Jai Bhim opens with scenes from a police station where cops sort released prisoners by their caste. Those who belong to certain castes are made to stand aside and assigned as suspects in unsolved crimes. In the film, based on real cases fought in the 1990s, members of the Irula and Korava communities are routinely treated as readily available accused for any case that urgently needs suspects and needs solving. The Irulas are hunters and trappers who are frequently called upon to rid houses, building sites, and village farms from snake and rat infestations and administer treatment to victims of snake bites. The Koravas, or Nari Koravas, as they are also known, are former jackal trappers who now reside on state-granted lands at the fringes of major cities like Chennai, performing odd jobs or selling handmade bead jewelry. Irulas and Koravas have long been agitating for land titles, ration cards, scheduled tribe certificates, all the documentary accoutrements which will make them legitimate beneficiaries of state welfare. Their decades-long attempts to attain scheduled tribe status is seen by bureaucrats and lawyers in the film as political opportunism. Troubling scenes of police torture depict in graphic detail the horrors wreaked on individual bodies when the tribal undertrials do not confess to the crimes they are accused of. Accusations are transferred with casual brutality onto the kin members of the accused, brothers, sisters, children, and pregnant wives. When one undertrial dies, another is easily found from among their community. Parallel scenes contrast to the scenes of death and violence, contrast lives lived in fields and forests, singing and dancing, trapping small game, and performing miraculous snake captures and healing venomous bites. The Irulas in the film are banished from the main village and city centers. They live in shanties and settlements in close-knit groups. They are regularly accused of being thieves and robbers. Their touch is considered impure. They are simultaneously revered and reviled for their expertise with snakes, rats, herbs, and medicines. The second case, in his ethnography of the Pramalai colors, a cultivator caste in the fertile agrarian plains of Tamil Nadu, the anthropologist Anand Pandian develops the idea of pastoral power, a mode of modern biopolitical governmentality in which the formerly criminal caste, the colors, are simultaneously made into subjects of improvement by the state and sketch their own horizons of moral improvement. By drawing on their quotidian intimacies with oxen and other domesticated animals, Pandian notes their constant evocation of their thievish pasts and attempts to overcome these thievish pasts in their post-colonial present. Blamed for habitual cattle theft, blackmail, and highway robbery by British officials through the 19th century, the color caste was designated in a criminal tribe as a criminal tribe in 1918. Until Indian independence, all colored men were fingerprinted, prohibited from leaving their villages without written permission, and subject to a range of official reform measures, regardless of whether or not they had committed any crimes. These agrarian politics and colonial histories continue to shape how men and women of the caste seek to make themselves into moral subjects in the present day. That's Pandian's argument. The Indian Criminal Tribes Act, which I've talked a little bit about, governed colors and other communities as organisms of impulsive, habitual, and instinctive criminality. Pandian find echoes of these colonial histories of policing in the everyday practices through which ploughmen, herdsmen, and cultivators seek to govern the thievish conduct of domesticated animals in the region and their own errant members. The government of the criminal animal is all, so this is just a very nice article by Anand called Pastoral Politics in the Post-Colony. So what he calls the government of the criminal animal is altogether lacking in any form of pastoral care in the example that the film raises, Jai Bhim. The bodies of Irula tribals are treated as repugnant, as disposable as the snakes as they release into the forest and the rats that they are shown to consume. Moving on to a brief discussion of my third case. The present-day lives of the Charas, a denotified community that live in Charanagar in the outskirts of Ahmedabad, continue to be laden with histories of their criminalization. In memory of Budan Sabar, who was picked up by the West Bengal police in 1998 in a crime he had no connection with and was killed in police custody, the Charas, under the mentorship of Dakshin Bajrange, founded the community theatre group Budan Theatre, which performs the Charas' collective historical experience of criminalization as ongoing living oral testimony. In a performance at Ahmedabad University in 2020, Dakshin detailed how the education of young people among the Chara included how to protect their bodies from the worst blows of the police, how to answer when they are picked up, and which civil society groups to access in case of imprisonment, in the event of imprisonment. Many forms of criminalization entered into the Indian state's management of the COVID-19 pandemic. With the onset of the pandemic, innumerable migrant worker bodies were forced out of cities due to no work and made to undertake arduous journeys from cities to hinterlands, thousands of kilometers on foot. En route, they encountered a paralyzed state, occasional charity, and police violence and brutality. Scenes of superhuman violence, superhuman endurance were matched only by scenes of their dehumanization at police checkpoints, where they were forced to crouch and sprayed with disinfectant chemicals. On 19th June 2020, a man called Jairaj and his son Benix, who were proprietors of a shop in the district of Thoothukudi in Tamil Nadu in South India, were picked up for inquiry by the Tamil Nadu police for keeping their shop, mobile phone shop, open beyond the hours permitted during the COVID-19 lockdown. The duo, according to the police, was allegedly held for keeping their mobile phone accessory shop open, as I said. And a first information report filed against the two. News reports, media reports, and reports by activist groups claim that the two men were sexually assaulted and tortured by the police while in custody, leading to their deaths eventually. The custodial death of the two men in Tamil Nadu's Thoothukudi district sparked massive outrage in the state over police brutality. You will recall that this was also the period during which the United States had erupted in outrage over police brutality and the racial killing of George Floyd. I do not attempt here an exhaustive ethnographic account of former criminal tribes and the immense diversity of their quest for a dignified life in modern India, nor yet can I hope to address the larger question of race and its portability as a form of modern biopolitical government that unequally distributes life and death. I only leave with this question, which is, do contemporary scenes of racialized government model the excess of certain affects, such as cruelty, vengeance, disgust, or lust, refracted through specifically targeted bodies, that of the hereditary criminal, the migrant, the Black body, or the Muslim body, in ways that essentialize and localize otherness, criminality, and animality in historically contingent ways? I'll stop with that.